You make it online. And welcome to everyone here face to face. Now, it's a great pleasure to have this seminar because it's a joint seminar of the Economics Department and the HAPS Network, the History and Philosophy and Social Sciences Network. And there's not a better candidate, I think, for talking on a topic which covers history and economics than Harry Bloch. Now, Harry's, as you know, is currently a distinguished emeritus fellow at Curtin University. He was a professor there from 1997 to 2002. And I have to confess, for being a student at Curtin, with my PhD at Curtin, I was a student there. And I remember well Harry arriving. There's a lot of energy and zest for encouraging research in economics, and did that with great success in the institution. His contribution to research flourished a lot under Harry's leadership there, so that was a great thing. Harry since has performed many service roles to the societies, the Economic Society. He's served as the editor and the co-editor of the Economic Record, which is an important role, and he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And since retiring, Harry's been working extensively on price theory, particularly Schumpeterian price theory, has published a nice book, which is well received, on Schumpeterian price theory from Routledge in 2017. What Harry's going to talk to us today is about the language of pluralism and the theory of price determination. This is a consistent theme too with Harry's career. It was even obvious to me in 1997 that Harry was a pluralist economist. He would talk to people in neoclassical schools and talk to people in classical schools and active in history. So that seems something that stayed with him, and now he's looking at the context of price theory. So Harry, welcome to UWA, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Michael. It is a great pleasure to be seeing people in person at a seminar, and with the added plus of having people attached electronically, some close, some further away, and having the facility to keep this forever electronically. It's been, I think, 3 years since I last did a face-to-face presentation. As Michael mentioned, I had a long-standing interest in price theory. Indeed, I was attracted to pricing and competition as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan in the 1960s, before some of you were born. And continued with postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago. All of that background was neoclassical, mainstream, although at different ends of the political spectrum, still pretty much the same theory. Subsequently, I've picked up bits and pieces along the way, especially at the University of Denver, where I had colleagues who were Marxists and post-Keynesians. And in my own further research, I've been interested in seeing how you can look at price theory from different perspectives. The pluralist approach that Michael mentioned. What I want to do today is to sort of put different approaches to price theory in a form where we can look at the contrasts and similarities across them. In the history of economic thought, you can see two extreme approaches to dealing with the development of theory. One, which I like to call a universalist, is the approach that takes a single theory and interprets everything else as either an antecedent or an objection to the one true theory. And individuals in all schools of thought can be found who take that approach to their own theory. And the other approach, which is certainly less common, is an approach that I call pluralism, which is to try to identify the distinctions between theories and see what can be made of using their distinctive features in approaching economic analysis, the real world. In this particular paper, I'm concerned with the importance of language and how you go about a pluralist approach to price theory. And I'm going to focus on how three different schools of thought use language in talking about their theoretical price concept. The thing that the theory of price determination has as output, the price that comes about as a result of the theoretical considerations. The question of then how you use that theory in looking at the real world is a separate issue, which we might get to in discussion, but I suspect probably not. So this is about theoretical concepts. And if we look at the three theories I'm going to deal with, they're the ones that I'm most familiar with. Neoclassical sits in the middle, that's what we teach mostly. Classical political economy and Keynesian economics are bracketing the classical school approach. I'm doing this chronologically to try and maintain as much neutrality as possible. But the key point is that all three of those schools of thought are alive and active today. So it's not that these are theoretical relics. They are live bodies. When Michael and I were originally setting up the seminar early in the year, the paper on which this seminar is based was still in the process of review, subsequently been published, put details up at the end. So I'm not going to go into much of the specifics of the paper. Only going to have a few key points that I draw from the discussion of the paper of the history of the development of ideas of each of these schools of thought. I'll mention individuals involved, contributors along the way, just in case it rings any bells with any of you, but I'm not going to focus on what they specifically said that leads me to the conclusions that I'm going to list as coming out of that approach to price theory. Hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion at the end. I'm happy to take questions as we go, but might put you off till later if it's something that will be hopefully clarified as we go along. So, oops. So what I've done for each theory is to list 4 key points about theory, price theory, within that school of thought. Focus point, a mechanical point about how the theory works, mechanism, the assumptions that I've chosen to identify as particularly important for the purpose of comparison across theories, and then the name that I'm going to suggest to be used for the theoretical price concept of that theory. So if we start with classical economics, and here I have in mind and in the paper mostly discuss the work of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, but also point to modern developments in classical economy, including mostly around the work of Piero Strauss from the 1960s. In Smith's inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, the focus is clearly on growth. When he talks about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, he's talking basically about GDP, about growth of national income, And in talking about nature and causes, he's focusing on what drives the wealth of the nations, the growth. David Ricardo, in the Principles of Political Economy, has more of a focus on income distribution. In particular, the distribution of income among the 3 social classes he identifies: workers, capitalists, and landlords, rentiers. So we have a theoretical body which has certain economic problems it's trying to provide analysis of. And what I'm suggesting is, in the case of classical political economy, that focuses on growth and income distribution. The price theory that is developed in order to do that analysis emphasizes the cost of production as the driver of price determination. Costs as a supply side consideration dominate prices. The idea here is that in order for the economy to function, it has to reproduce itself, has to be able to sustain each of the groups, workers, capitalists, landowners, that are components of the capitalist economy. In the case of workers, the emphasis is on subsistence. That in order to be able to continue the economy, you have to be able to provide workers with enough income that they can survive and that their families can survive. Because otherwise, after one generation, you're out of workers. So the idea is that in order to move the economy forward, the income of the working class has to be sufficient to be able to survive and reproduce. And the same goes for capitalists. They have to be able to get enough income to maintain their style of living. And in both Smith and Ricardo, accumulate, have a surplus to be able to expand the economy. So it's not just simple reproduction, it's expanded reproduction. The emphasis on the cost of production as determining prices is an outcome of that focus on reproduction. You need to be able to have prices that are sufficient to pay the workers the subsistence wages, capitalists rate of return, sufficient to continue consuming and to accumulate. And the rentiers, probably not so important in the ideas of the classical economists, but they do need to be able to get a signal to put their land to the most productive use, which is not much. So they're not generally viewed very positively. So we have a system with reproduction as its driving force, and the cost of production determine prices. And the way that is spoken about in classical political economy is in terms of a natural price for a commodity. So there's a distinction between market prices, which is a thing that actually happens, and natural prices, which are determined by these costs of productions which are necessary for reproduction. A lot of debate about whether the natural price is the center of gravity of the market price. Almost certainly in the case of Smith, it's viewed that way, not so clear elsewhere. So focus, growth and income distribution, mechanism for determining prices, cost of production, the assumptions about what's driving the economy, its motive force, its social and economic reproduction, and the price concept is
Harry,
yes.
can I interrupt briefly, just to understand the concept here. A price has a numerator, right? We're measuring price in terms of something. The most common prices we will deal with prices in terms of money. Those prices then determine the level of those prices are really just the exchange rate between money and goods, and therefore monetary phenomena. And so the prices you're referring to, I think, are real prices, that is, prices where the numerator is, say, a factor of production, like labor or land. Right? So you're measuring your cost of production based on that, rather than just on some monetary phenomenon, which historically back then, depended on the supply of various means for supplying them. So it's a question of numerator. I'm just wondering if you want to explain that a little further.
Okay, so it's easiest if we think of natural price as a relative price.
Yeah. Relative to what is the question?
Okay. Well, relative to yeah. So I haven't mentioned Schrafa in this context, and I think that's probably a complication we'll leave aside for later discussion. The easiest interpretation is in terms of labor.
Yeah.
So Ricardo tried very hard to discuss the paper to use labor as a numerator. A day's worth of labor. So a bushel of corn is worth a quarter of a day's worth of labor. And that's probably the easiest way to think about it as we go forward. Okay, so contrast, and here it might help to have the theory that's most familiar to most of you identified in terms of the same 4 points. So, with neoclassical theory, in the paper, I devote most attention to Marshall, Alfred Marshall, coming at the sort of, say, consolidation of ideas that we now consider to be neoclassical. Emphasizing partial equilibrium analysis using supply and demand. So if we want to think most directly, commonly about what neoclassical economics means, it would be that you have given technology, given preferences, tastes, given endowments of natural resources, and based on that, you have consumers who have demands for goods, commodities, and producers who offer supply. Both the demand and supply are sensitive to price. In standard case, demand curves are downward sloping with respect to price. Supply curves are upward sloping, where the curves cross a theoretically determined price. Theoretically, in the sense that you draw the curves, they don't have to have any empirical basis, and where they cross is the equilibrium price according to the theory. The theory tells you that if price is too higher than that equilibrium price, there are forces at work to drive it down. It's below, forces at work to drive it up. So a price may not be equal to an equilibrium price, but the equilibrium price is clearly the attractor of price, just like in classical political economy, at least in Smith's version, natural price is the center of gravity for market prices. And that has led a lot of historians of thought in the Universalist tradition, writing from a neoclassical perspective, to view classical political economy as the antecedent to neoclassical economics and ignore everything else.
I was making an observation. A lot of neoclassical economists, not historians, thought exactly the same. That is, the people creating neoclassical thought themselves as, inheritance. It's classical. Marshall is a classic example, and those are people as well.
So clearly, in my heroes, history of economic analysis, Joseph Schumpeter, that is the train of thought, the organizing principle, that you have a progressive discipline where you take stuff from the past and you build on it and you move forward. And it's certainly the kind of history of economic thought I was taught by George Stigler. So that's the standard model, what I call a universalist approach to the history of thought. Okay, so the concept of an equilibrium price in neoclassical economics is incredibly strong, to the extent that when Paul Samuelson comes to talk about adjustment in the economy, he develops a correspondence principle, which is that if you have a change in the economy and you want to know what happens, what you do is you look at the equilibrium before the change and the equilibrium after the change. And that tells you what you need to know. Dynamics are a question of comparing equilibrium positions before and after. And that's,
Sorry, just to expand on that, so what you need then is a Walrasian option, so that presumably you're going to come to that, I guess, but you need some system that says if there's excess demand, the price has to go up. If there's excess supply, the price has to fall.
without any trading in between.
Yeah.
Footnote about that. Okay. So the final I'm going to talk about is post-Keynesianism. Chronologically it comes later, but calling it post-Keynesian is, at least in terms of price theory, is a misnomer because the foundations go back before Keynes, at least before the general theory. And in particular, to work done mostly in the early years of the 20th century by what we probably today would call institutionalist economics. In America, in Britain, the Oxford Economics Group was particularly a group that believed that the way you found out about the economy is going and talking to the people involved. So they did surveys of businessmen and they wanted to find out about pricing behavior. And in America, particularly important was Gardner Means, who wrote a book with a world called corporate something like corporations in modern American economy. The essential idea was that circumstances changed with the growth of large firms in the latter part of the 19th century by the trust movement in the US and the corresponding emergence of very large industrial concerns in Britain. These organizations had if you will, lives of their own. They had an ability to influence the development of markets, pricing, suppliers, beyond what was presumed in neoclassical economics. And that power was important to understanding how the economy now behaved. So because of the change in the structure of the economy, the institutions, it was necessary to move on to a different way of analyzing the economy. Now, I've put as focus here firm growth and macro stability. That comes later in the development of post-Keynesian economics. The original focus was behavioralism. How do these large organizations behave? And they behave by applying rules and routines. The tide of firm growth and macro stability comes about when you start thinking about how do they determine the rules and routines? What drives the behavior that has been observed empirically by these large organizations? And in focusing on that question of what their driving force is, the consideration is given to their internal needs. Very large organizations need to be able to control the bits and pieces that are involved in the organization. So they need ways of centralizing control. Rules and routines are good for that. So you say that each branch that they need to have prices that are double their cost, direct costs of production. That's a rule. And you can actually monitor that from the center even before modern computers. So you have to keep in mind that technologies, large organizations, as large or larger than modern organizations in terms of the number of employees, how they needed to control their operations, the time without real-time control. They needed to control and they needed to survive. So very important in setting up their rules and routines was making sure that they'd be able to sustain themselves from one year to the next. And that's not really enough. That's not very ambitious. So growth became a key consideration in the design of the rules and routines that are being used to set prices within the organization. So firm growth became an issue. Stability of the firm became an issue, survival. But the link to macro stability came later when it was realized that for micro stability, what they would want to do is maintain relatively constant prices. But that made it easier for them to control their organization. If the relatively constant prices could be maintained, then they would be able to satisfy their needs for reproduction, sustainability, and even provide a basis for growth. So price stability at the micro level, combined with Keynes's theory of macro determination through aggregate demand, were put together and became Keynesian economics, in which the individual firm stability in prices generated macro instability. Because instead of prices adjusting when demand fluctuated, it would be output and employment that fluctuated.
That if you establish the rules that
So you have a rule that says price is twice direct cost, and you have a routine which involves price leadership. Now, price leadership may or may not lead to absolute price stability, and indeed, even a market rule double the direct cost might not lead to price stability. But relative to supply and demand, it does lead to micro price stability because you've ruled out one of the potential influences for price changes at the level of the firm, which is a change in sales. So my own work in post-Keynesian economics has actually been more about inflation. What does post-Keynesian pricing mean for inflation, which is definitely not price stability, but relatively to supply and demand analysis, prices are stable. And of course,
sorry, Joan Robinson, talking about her contributions on large firm, the effects on large firms and the rules they use to determine prices, the monopoly pricing and things of that sort. Or would you regard her as being a neoclassical left-wing economists who nonetheless use neoclassical.
So in the paper, there's a fair amount of discussion of Mikhail Kalecki, the Polish economist. Kalecki had a lot of influence on Robinson. So early Robinson, like the economics of imperfect competition, definitely neoclassical. Left wing. Although you wouldn't know that from reading that book, but clearly she was left wing. Later on, after she had been influenced by Kalecki, she adopted a much more quasi post-Keynesian, an approach more consistent with this depiction of post-Keynesian. So one thing I've mentioned market power. The other thing that's important in terms of understanding how post-Keynesian price theory works is that firms are heterogeneous. That each firm faces unique circumstances. So they're large organizations, the important firms, the large industrial. They have their own organization with its built up knowledge and networks. They have specific capital equipment that have accumulated over the history of the firm. They have their own history of rules and routines. They have their own strategic objectives. So you can't think of a firm as representative of anything, and certainly is not being identified. The starting point of the post-Keynesian analysis is the individual firm. Working out how they interact is then a secondary issue. Some post-Keynesian price theorists never get there. And others, like Kalecki, do worry about the interaction explicitly. This is relatively recent. It's compared to Adam Smith and even Upward Marshall. Post-Keynesian economics in general and post-Keynesian price theory is still very much in a stage of development. And consistency across contributors is hard to identify. But in talking about the price concept, I've chosen administered price as the name to use for trying to have a discussion across schools of thought. So if you're talking about how post-Keynesians and classical political economists differ, and you want a shortcut, label, administered price versus natural price is the shortcut to use in having that discussion. Administered price is the terminology that Gardner Means uses, one of the earlier ones, and it's also the name that Fred Lee, who wrote a very important book, Post-Keynesian Price Theory in the late 90s, identifies as the best guess at a common denominator across the various post-Keynesian price theories. And it fits with the rules and routines synthesis, which is a commonality across contributors. That it's the administration of price, which is the key. That organizations are using this to control their activities, to control their interaction with other firms in the same industry, and to control their interaction with the economy. So it's a managerial, administrative kind of concept. In an early version of this paper, I used normal price in various comments of the presentation and referees. That created all kinds of trouble because it was pointed out quite currently, normal is a price concept used by a very large number of authors in all the different schools of thought. So it wouldn't be appropriate to appropriate it for a particular school. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to point to as a basis for having discourse across schools of thought. I could have brought in Marxian economics, Austrian economics, modern institutionalist economics, but I don't really know enough about them, and 3 is probably sufficient to phrase the point that there are ways of distinguishing different approaches to price theory, and then ways of identifying language to use in discussing the distinctive features of each of those theories, so that you can have discussion with people who have other models in their mind, and you can, in doing what Jeff Harper used to call horses for courses analysis, have a whole set of models, theories in your toolbox instead of a single. And where you saw circumstances that were appropriate to a particular theory, pull that out, and didn't worry about having to have everything fit into one brand dish.
Thank you, Harry.
No, great. Tony wants to ask a question. He raised his hand several times.
So who's asking for the question?
Tony came.
Ken. Okay.
Tony was first, I think. Right.
Thanks, Ken. If you can unmute, that'll be good. And then Tony.
Okay. How's that? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Okay. I take it that all 3 approaches, the objective is to try to throw some light on what we observe prices. So they're all trying to explain the same thing. So you might think about setting up a horse race between the 3 and trying to test which one works better at explaining what the objective is of the observed pattern of prices. But I don't think that's going to work, because I suspect all 3 approaches have way too many parameters. They're all under-identified. You can think about, these assumptions as being parameters. So that's not going to work. So the question remains, if we want to back one, how do we choose? To say that we can have all 3 approaches is not completely satisfactory to my mind. If we want to just back one, could we choose on somewhat different criteria, choose on the basis of which one seems to be the most useful? Now, the most useful, it's a bit of a slippery sort of a way to put it, because most useful, you'd think it probably has connotations of coming back to explaining observed prices. But most useful can be okay here. Is it most useful when we want to explain what's going on? We want to explain to our students what's going on, if you want to back one approach rather than the other. What do you think about these ideas, Harry?
Thanks, Ken. You can hear me still?
Yeah.
Good. So I think there are probably two basic points. One which you skirted around, which is that it's difficult to think of an appropriate arena in which you would put the theories against each other. And indeed, my own perspective is that that's really not the point. The theories are focusing on different problems, different conceptions of the economic problem. And they're particularly good at different things. So if you want to analyze, let's say, growth, and you're using neoclassical economics, you have to provide a fair amount of auxiliary paraphernalia, because the idea of equilibrium is one that doesn't fit well with growth. It doesn't fit well with, at least with growth that is anything other than systematic and steady. And so it pulls out, in terms of my own interest, Schumpeterian type of analysis, where growth is driven by disruptive innovation. It's very hard to fit entrepreneurs into neoclassical theory. It's pretty hard with classical theory, a little bit easier with post-Keynesianism. So depending on the problem, our courses for courses, you're going to get a different kind of relative advantage. The other issue is method in the realm of epistemology. The question of whether you can find a testing regime to compare theories is something which has been hotly debated for most of my lifetime, starting from Popper and going through Lakatos and then Kuhn and modern reconstructionists. There are different views on whether truth can be revealed by taking repeated observations of reality. And that's a very interesting topic. But until we can make progress on that kind of issue, even though it's messy and inconvenient, my position is that it's useful to go to the effort of having multiple theories and having a way of discussing problems using more than one theory, not necessarily at the same time.
Thanks, Harry. We'll go to Tony now. Tony, if you can unmute yourself. Thanks.
Hi, Tony.
I'm unmuted, I hope. Hi, Harry, and I'm really pleased to see you continuing on with this very ambitious research program that I've been reading about for quite a few years now and admiring. But I've got two comments, separate comments. The first comment relates to the dangers of doctrinal caricature in your simple distinctions. I know they're simple and they're being used heuristically. And the second point relates to pluralism. First, on the doctrinal caricature dangers here. If you look at your neoclassical slide, it clearly is a great simplification of neoclassicism, as I understand it. Cornot understood monopoly. So did Marshall. And then later in the neoclassical tradition, we've got, as you mentioned earlier, Robinson and also Chamberlain in the 30s, understanding other types of market structures in which prices are determined, not in purely price-taking markets, but complicated markets, monopoly, monopolistic competition, duopoly, oligopoly, and so on. And in those markets, prices are administered to some extent. The players are actually administering prices all the time. And so the neoclassicals, you know, they got a handle on administering prices, or the administered prices, well before the post-Keynesians. I think it's a bit rich to say that the post-Keynesians discovered administered prices. And so there are great dangers when you do this Procrustean thing of cutting off traditions as if there is a representative neoclassical, such as Marshall. And in fact, there was a long tradition of thinking about price determination in the neoclassical tradition, and I would start probably with Cournot, as Marshall did, by the way. Now, in relation to pluralism, if we just narrow that question down, I know you mentioned the Austrians and others, and of course, this thing can get out of control, but within the Keynesian tradition itself, there are pluralistic approaches to price determination. I can give you two examples off the top of my head. I can think of Leonufud and his ideas about process analysis and the determination of prices in process, the adaptive adjustment processes of actual markets in the economy. And he went on about this in his early work on Keynesian economics. And then another approach in Keynesian economics that might be interesting is Hicks's distinction in his book in 1974, I think it was, The Crisis of Keynesian Economics, where he distinguishes between flex price determination and fixed price determination. The fixed price is, of course, what you would call administered prices. And in that discussion, a really interesting discussion where he's criticizing simple Keynesianism for thinking of administrative prices on their own, he argues that flex price markets, the kind of neoclassical markets, can't survive without some underlying base of fixed price determination. And I think that approach, you know, just off the cuff, is a far better way of thinking about how complex price determination is in capitalist economies. There we are. That's all. That's the basis of my two comments.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. I have no problem with the notion that putting down schools of thought in terms of their approach to price theory in 4 dot points of a line or less is problematic. And indeed, I guess the best I can do in justifying it is that it provides a basis for discussion, such as we're having. So, right on, very good. Regarding pluralism and in particular the issue of Keynesianism, yeah, there are plenty of different approaches, some of which are mentioned here, more in the paper, but not Leon. Sorry, Leon. There's clearly scope in the post-Keynesian approach for there to be flexible prices. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier in response to Michael, my own work in post-Keynesian economics has mostly been about using post-Keynesian models to look at inflation, which is not a fixed price phenomenon. But my approach to inflation in the post-Keynesian tradition draws on Kalecki. And while most post-Keynesian analysis is pretty much limited to the large industrial organizations which administer price
Have we lost you?
I cannot hear anymore.
Have we lost the feed?
Seems that way. Yeah.
They are, you know, the microphone is muted.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, it's come back.
Now you're okay? So in Pilecki's work, there's manufacturing which is dominated by large organizations that use administered prices and set prices according to markup rules. So double direct cost determines the price. And then there are raw material producers who operate in supply and demand. The manufacturers don't react directly, but as they increase or decrease their consumption of raw materials, the raw material price
I can't hear anymore again.
Could be a dead spot over in that corner.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron. If you could ask.
I don't know much about the history of thought, and I certainly have been trained in the neoclassical tradition, so that it's very hard to move beyond that from my point of view. And when you discuss the new Keynesian tradition, I don't really understand how it works, because how can you have, let's even imagine a monopoly in a particular market that uses a markup rule without any sense of demand, right? You have to embody inventory accumulation or something that is going to be a consequence of the quote unquote disequilibrium that emerges from it. So my sense is that very hard. Perhaps it is in what you just said that the factor prices change. Right? I mean, these are such big firms that, you know, if they all behave similarly, then the factor prices change, and that's where you get the relative price differences that bring about equilibrium relative to demand. That may be the answer to it, but it's hard for me to see it.
Yeah, well, the thing which I haven't really mentioned about rules and routines is that they're not immutable. So when we have let's say 100% markup, it's based on the analysis on the firm's strategic objectives at the time, based on their analysis of market conditions. So they say 100% markup, let's say you're a department store, goods come in, you set the price based on doubling the wholesale cost. And you go along and you discover that you're losing market share or accumulating inventories. And you have both short-term responses like clearance sales and longer-term responses, adjusting your rules, which might mean changing the markup among other things. So
on average, you're a neoclassical firm. Sorry, you're a neo-Keynesian firm. Well, behaving like neoclassical firms. Right? So on average, right? They're clearing their market, but they're setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Right? So they maximize profit.
There are two questions that arise. One, that's been very much a issue in the history of economic thought, and that is whether a center of gravity notion of price is the same as an equilibrium notion of price. And I guess the purists say no, and yet the universalists say yes. The other question, which is probably more relevant to the practical application of economics, is does disequilibrium, if you want to put it that way, trading matter? So
Well, how long does it last? I mean,
that's right.
yeah.
So clearly in the post-Keynesian tradition, this is not, price rules and routines are not things which are changed daily, weekly, monthly. It's only when there's a crisis that the firm recognizes from the center that they start doing serious analysis of their rules and routines. And that's, at least years, if not decades, kind of perspective. So the out of equilibrium trading goes on for a long time. And if you believe history matters, that the actual path of things influences the future, that's a very different perspective than the neoclassical, the top to long kind of perspective.
Well, there is a neoclassical tradition that says that monopolists don't survive in the long run. Competition always arises, and that may be a long run story that they carry as well. In the meantime, from my perspective, it's always worked that you look at whatever the optimal pricing is that maximises their profit. And certainly, if you apply this to the modern monopolists, right, the large IT companies.
That's a very important point, that we're talking about differences in perspective, not different worlds. So it's not that the post-Keynesian world is a different world than the neoclassical world or the classical political economy world. They are all referencing the same reality. And the differences are differences, perspective, interpretation, emphasis, rather than differences that are irreconcilable. When I first became interested in different perspectives on price theory, my immediate reaction was, well, how do we show that they have commonalities? How do we demonstrate the conditions under which a natural price is equal to an equilibrium price or a post-Keynesian administered price? And there's a substantial literature, especially in post-Keynesian economics, about does it matter that there are commonalities or not? Over time, I've become more sympathetic to the position that it does matter. The fact that you can show the conditions under which an administered price is just a Cournot price, which was a literature that was really popular around the time I was first getting into economics. That's not the point. I mean, it's important to know that, but the point is that there are other situations and other problems for which the two approaches lead to fundamentally different interpretations or applications about what's going on in the economy, in the real world.
Income distribution, for example.
Income distribution, growth.
Any other questions?
Hello. I wanted to ask about the last question on that slide, which was, is pluralism useful?
Okay. Let's see if I can get the slide back. Can I get rid of?
Share screen.
Yeah. Oh,
I
yeah.
think just click on that. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, you were talking about how there was something useful about having multiple theories to look at problems through. I wonder if there's a risk though, and maybe this gets back to, I think it was Ken's question at the beginning, about how it might, if you switch between theories that have very different underlying assumptions, it can be seen as lacking in rigor. So for example, in psychology, it doesn't make a lot of sense to switch between different perspectives, for example, psychoanalysis and then behaviorism or blah, 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 because they have very different underlying assumptions. So with psychoanalysis, it's something like the importance of early experiences in changing how we interpret the world, whereas behaviorism, it's the mind is a blank slate. So what's your thoughts on maintaining rigor when trying to shift through different theoretical frameworks?
Let me try and clarify what you mean by rigor. So if by rigor you mean there being one grand theory that explains everything, so that everything can fit into that theory, like neoclassical economics is operated by and large, then we're in trouble, because if there is one truth, or at least one theory that is better than all the others, then using analysis which doesn't fit with that is non-rigorous, and whether it's useful or not is then a different issue, but it's certainly non-rigorous.
I'm thinking about, I guess the benchmark would be in terms of like underlying conceptual assumptions. So for example, I guess one very basic one that I can think of is the idea that there's some form of objective reality. So I'm just using examples from psychology because that's what I'm a bit more familiar with. But for example, it doesn't make much sense to use any of the theories that are based in some sort of reality, whether that's biological drives or some forms of behavioral conditioning, to use those, but then to switch to, say, there's social constructionist kind of theories where there's multiple truths, there's no objective reality. So I guess that's what I'm talking about with rigor.
Yeah. So I think it's very hard to be useful and maintain that kind of rigor looking across schools of thought. And I haven't emphasized the philosophical differences between these schools of thought, but they are profound. I mean, the ontology of whether you look at the world as a closed system or an open system differs between neoclassical analysis and post-Keynesian analysis, at least when it comes up into the discussion, which is not very often, but there is that kind of fundamental distinction. And the epistemological issue that came up in answering Ken's question. Ken, neoclassical, there is a belief that you can observe the world and use it to distinguish whether your theory is right or wrong. Mostly completely ignored in empirical work in neoclassical tradition, because if something doesn't fit, you develop a auxiliary postulate hypothesis to explain away that nonconformity. But in certainly the modern classical approach, no neo-Ricardian would think of the world as something that you can use to sort out the differences between neoclassical understanding of how the world works and neoclassical and neo-Ricardian that just doesn't.
Can I make an observation here? Most economists recognize it's really limits with whatever theory you have. And you have this analysis, the theory is very analytical, but the understanding of the concrete phenomenon is synthetic. You look at your empirics, what do empirics say? You look at history, what does history say? And how does it tell? And without theory, you can get a very, very rough only approximation. The pluralistic approach is really saying, well, there's a synthesis already there in any science. Let's just make the synthesis go across different theoretical approaches. So it's not, pluralism is not fundamentally radical, I don't think, for people who even work within a single stream, because they all recognise that there's different things you need to consider in the economic phenomenon.
Well, I was going to go on to even more radical interpretation of what pluralism is about, and that is that there is one true theory, but we don't know what it is. And pluralism is a way of hedging your bets until you come to the understanding of what the world really is. So there are pluralists of that view that pluralism is important to pushing forward and trying to find truth, because it could be any one of the alternatives. Yes.
I was just wondering whether the different approaches to the theory of price discrimination hold equally across different factor markets. And the reason I ask that is that economic anthropologists, for instance, would say that the labour market is fundamentally different because it is culturally structured in a way that the capital markets, for instance, aren't. So,
absolutely. I mean, I shouldn't say absolutely. Depending on the theory. So in neoclassical theory, there is an effort to use one theory for all markets, capital, labor, product, with little variations around the edges. Certainly not in post-Keynesian analysis. Labor market analysis has very little to do with what I've talked about is price theory, because it's a price theory for product markets that I was addressing. Classical political economy, I have more trouble with because there clearly are social and environmental kinds of considerations, but I'm not expert enough on it to try to postulate on the degree of differentiation.
Thanks, Harry. We're almost at 1:15, so we'll finish in a moment. Me just asking, is there any final question from either online? Online?
Everything is online.
Yeah.
It's still online.
It doesn't look like it.
They might have been cancelled in the latest.
Okay. Look, it just remains for me just to thank Harry very much for coming in. Very stimulating discussion. Does us a lot of good, I think, to reflect on these types of issues in economics and in the social sciences in general. So I appreciate you coming in, Harry, and thank you so much.